Standing majestically at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., the White House is far more than just a building. It's a living monument to American history and democracy. The construction of this iconic mansion began in 1792, designed by Irish-born architect James Hoban, marking the birth of a symbol that would represent the American presidency for centuries to come. In 1800, President John Adams and his wife Abigail became the first residents, moving into a building that was still unfinished, with wet plaster on the walls and construction ongoing around them. The White House has witnessed dramatic moments throughout American history. It survived being burned by British forces during the War of 1812, after which it was carefully restored and repainted brilliant white, a transformation that helped cement its famous name. Through the tumultuous Civil War under Abraham Lincoln, 2 World Wars, the Civil Rights Movement, and countless pivotal moments, this residence has served as the nerve center of American leadership. Today, with 132 rooms, 35 bathrooms, and 6 levels, the White House continues to function simultaneously as a family home, executive office, and museum of American heritage, welcoming over 1 million visitors annually who come to witness history firsthand. Continue this video before please like, comment, share, and subscribe this channel. The birth of an American icon, the White House's foundation 1792 to 1800. In the sweltering summer of 1792, when the United States of America was barely a teenager as a nation, a vision began to take physical form on a plot of land overlooking the Potomac River. This vision would become the White House, the most recognizable residence in the world and the enduring symbol of American democracy. But the story of its beginning is far more dramatic, controversial, and deeply human than most people realize. President George Washington, the man who had led the colonies to independence and now served as the first president under the new Constitution, stood on a muddy hillside in what would become Washington, D.C., examining architectural drawings with intense scrutiny. The capital city itself was nothing more than a grand idea at this point, a federal district carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia, mostly consisting of forests, marshes, and a few scattered farms. Washington had personally selected this location for the president's house, choosing a site that offered commanding views and symbolic prominence. He envisioned a residence that would project dignity and permanence, proving to skeptical European powers that this young republic intended to endure. The competition to design the president's house had been fierce and politically charged. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, an accomplished architect himself, had submitted an anonymous design inspired by classical Roman villas, favoring a modest Republican simplicity that reflected his democratic ideals. But Washington had other ideas. He wanted something grander, something that would command respect on the world stage while still embodying American values. The winner was James Hoban, an Irish-born architect living in Charleston, South Carolina, whose design drew inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin, the seat of the Irish Parliament. Hoban's neoclassical design featured symmetrical wings, elegant proportions, and a dignified facade that struck the perfect balance between Republican modesty and national prestige. On October 13, 1792, the cornerstone was laid in a ceremony that combined a Masonic ritual with patriotic fervor. The exact location of this cornerstone remains one of the White House's enduring mysteries, as it has never been definitively found despite numerous searches over the centuries. The ceremony itself was modest compared to the grand spectacle that marked the laying of the Capitol's cornerstone, but it was no less significant. Local landowners, laborers, and government officials gathered to witness this historic moment, understanding that they were present at the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a palace for an elected leader in a nation without kings. The construction of the president's house presented enormous challenges that would test the resolve of everyone involved. The federal district was essentially wilderness, lacking the infrastructure, skilled labor, and materials needed for such an ambitious project. Sandstone had to be quarried from Aquia Creek in Virginia and transported by boat up the Potomac River. Scottish stonemasons were recruited for their expertise in working with this challenging material, joining a diverse workforce that included free black laborers, European craftsmen, and enslaved people who were hired out by their owners. This last fact is one of the most troubling aspects of the White House's construction. A reminder that even as America was building monuments to liberty, the institution of slavery remained deeply embedded in the nation's economy and culture. The work progressed slowly through the 1790s, plagued by funding shortages, labor disputes, and the sheer logistical complexity of building a massive structure in what was essentially a remote location. Congress had appropriated funds for the construction of the president's house in the Capitol, but the money never seemed adequate for the grandiose visions that had been approved. James Hoban found himself constantly negotiating, improvising, and managing a sprawling operation that employed dozens of workers at any given time. The sandstone walls gradually rose from the ground, their pale color giving the building a luminous quality that would eventually inspire its famous name, though it wouldn't be officially called the White House for more than a century. George Washington visited the construction site frequently, taking a personal interest in every detail. He insisted on changes to Hoban's original design, making the building nearly 30% larger than initially planned. Washington wanted rooms that could accommodate the ceremonial functions of the presidency and demonstrate American sophistication to foreign diplomats. He oversaw the selection of materials, approved architectural details, and ensured that the quality of workmanship met his exacting standards. Despite his deep involvement, Washington knew he would never live in the house he had championed so vigorously. His presidency would end in 1797, and the house wouldn't be ready for occupancy for several years after that. The symbolism of building a president's house in a new capital city on land that had been wilderness just years before cannot be overstated. European capitals had evolved over centuries, their palaces and government buildings accumulating layers of history, tradition, and architectural grandeur. America was creating everything from scratch, inventing traditions and building institutions simultaneously. The president's house represented a bold statement about American ambitions and values. Unlike the hereditary palaces of European monarchs, this would be a house temporarily occupied by elected leaders who would surrender power peacefully at regular intervals. It was a revolutionary concept, and the building needed to embody this unique political philosophy while still commanding the respect accorded to seats of power. As the 1790s drew to a close, the structure began to take recognizable form. The exterior walls were largely complete, their aqueous sandstone giving the building an elegant finished appearance even as interior work continued at a frantic pace. Craftsmen installed elaborate plasterwork, woodworkers carved intricate details, and painters applied coats of whitewash to protect the porous sandstone from the elements. This whitewash would be reapplied many times over the coming decades, gradually reinforcing the building's association with the color white in the public imagination. John Adams, who succeeded Washington as president in 1797, watched the construction progress with mixed feelings. He would be the first president to live in the house, but he knew it would be far from finished when he moved in. In 1800, with the presidential election looming and his re-election uncertain, Adams and his wife Abigail prepared to relocate from Philadelphia, the temporary capital, to the muddy, unfinished village of Washington. The president's house awaited them. Its exterior impressive, but its interior still raw and incomplete, lacking basic amenities and with many rooms unusable. The story of the White House's construction is fundamentally a story about American optimism and ambition. In 1792, when that cornerstone was laid, the United States was an unlikely experiment in self-government, surrounded by monarchies that expected it to fail. Building a capital city from scratch, complete with a presidential residence that could rival European palaces in grandeur while surpassing them in democratic meaning, was an audacious act of faith in the future. Every stone laid, every beam raised, and every detail carved represented a bet that this republic would survive and prosper. The men and women who labored on its construction, free and enslaved, immigrant and native-born, skilled craftsman and common laborer, built more than a house. They built a symbol that would endure for centuries, witnessing the unfolding drama of American history within its walls. A cold November, welcome. John Adams moves into an unfinished dream, 1800. On the first day of November in 1800, President John Adams arrived at the president's house in the new federal city of Washington, and what he found was both magnificent and utterly disheartening. The carriage carrying the second president of the United States rumbled through muddy, unfinished streets lined with tree stumps and scattered construction debris, tassing half-built government buildings and boarding houses that constituted the entirety of America's new capital. As the president's house came into view, Adams must have felt a complex mixture of pride and dismay. The structure was undeniably impressive, its pale sandstone walls rising elegantly against the autumn sky, but it stood virtually alone in a wilderness, surrounded by workers' shacks, piles of building materials, and the raw earth scarred by construction. Adams had come alone, traveling ahead of his wife Abigail, who remained at their home in Quincy, Massachusetts, attending to family matters and dreading the move to what she had heard was little more than a swamp. The president had left the temporary capital in Philadelphia with mixed emotions, knowing that his presidency was in jeopardy. The election of 1800 was already underway, and the bitter contest between Adams and his former friend Thomas Jefferson had divided the young nation along fierce partisan lines. The Federalist Party that Adams represented was fracturing, and his vice president, Thomas Jefferson himself, was running against him as the leader of the Democratic-Republican opposition. Moving into the unfinished president's house seemed almost symbolic of Adams's political situation. Grand in conception, but incomplete in execution, isolated and uncertain. When Adams stepped through the entrance of the president's house for the first time as its occupant, he encountered a scene of organized chaos that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. Only 6 of the planned 36 rooms were even marginally habitable. Plasterers, painters, and carpenters were still working frantically throughout the building, their tools and materials scattered across unfinished floors. There was no grand staircase yet connecting the floors, forcing the president to use temporary wooden steps that seemed absurdly modest for such an imposing structure. The oval drawing room that would later become the Blue Room was still under construction. Many windows lacked glass, and cold November winds whistled through the gaps, making the vast high-ceilinged rooms almost impossible to heat despite the fireplaces that had been installed. The condition of the president's house reflected the broader reality of the federal city itself. Washington, D.C. in 1800 was more ambitious vision than actual city. Congress had mandated the move from Philadelphia, but the new capital was woefully unprepared to receive the government. Pennsylvania Avenue, which would eventually become one of America's most famous streets, was little more than a rutted dirt path connecting the president's house to the Capitol building, itself still under construction. On rainy days, and there were many that autumn, the avenue became an impassable quagmire of mud that swallowed wagon wheels and ruined fine shoes. The few boarding houses that existed were overcrowded with congressmen and government officials who complained bitterly about the primitive conditions, the lack of amenities, and the isolation from civilized society. Abigail Adams finally arrived at the president's house on a gray, cheerless day in mid-November, and her reaction was one of practical horror mixed with determined resilience. In letters to her family, she described the president's house as habitable but surrounded by forest, with not a single fence or yard to mark its boundaries. The main stairs remained unfinished, forcing her to navigate through servants' passages. The famous East Room, which would one day host elaborate state dinners and diplomatic receptions, was completely unfinished, its plaster walls bare and its windows letting in both light and cold air. Abigail, ever resourceful, immediately saw one practical use for the vast empty space. She ordered clotheslines strung across the East Room and used it to dry the presidential laundry, turning the grandest room in the house into a glorified drying shed. The Adams family, along with their small staff, struggled to make the president's house livable during that first winter. Firewood was scarce and expensive, requiring constant deliveries that often failed to materialize due to the poor roads and lack of reliable suppliers in the underdeveloped capital. The president and first lady found themselves confined to a handful of rooms that could be adequately heated, leaving vast portions of the house dark, cold, and abandoned. Abigail wrote that she needed fires in 13 fireplaces just to keep a few rooms comfortable, and even then, the drafty windows and doors made warmth elusive. The president's house had been designed for grandeur and ceremony, but the Adams family lived in it more like frontier settlers than rulers of a nation. Despite these hardships, Adams recognized the profound symbolism of the moment. On his second night in the president's house, he wrote a letter to Abigail containing a prayer that would become one of the most famous benedictions in American history. Standing in the dining room surrounded by unpacked boxes and unfinished walls, Adams wrote, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. These words, later inscribed on the mantel of the state dining room by President Franklin Roosevelt, captured Adams's hope that the president's house would be more than just a residence. It would be a sacred trust, a place where the better angels of American democracy would prevail. The daily reality of living in the president's house that first winter was far removed from such lofty sentiments. The Adams family and their servants navigated a building that was simultaneously too large and too small. Too large to heat, clean and maintain properly, yet too small to accommodate all the ceremonial functions expected of it. When Adams hosted his first official reception in the unfinished house, guests picked their way through muddy streets and entered rooms where the smell of fresh paint and plaster competed with wood smoke from overworked fireplaces. Foreign diplomats, accustomed to the established splendor of European courts, must have wondered what kind of nation built such an ambitious palace in the middle of nowhere and then moved in before it was ready. The servants who worked in the president's house faced particular challenges. The building lacked adequate service spaces, forcing them to improvise constantly. The kitchens were poorly equipped and located far from the dining areas, meaning that food arrived at the table lukewarm at best. Water had to be carried in from outdoor wells, as indoor plumbing was still years away. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, and basic maintenance required Herculean efforts in a building designed for show rather than practical living. Some of the servants were free workers hired for wages, while others were enslaved people brought from Adams's home or hired from local slaveholders, a reminder of the moral contradiction at the heart of the nation that claimed to cherish liberty. As winter deepened and the election results became clear, Adams knew his time in the president's house would be brief. Thomas Jefferson had won the bitterly contested election, and Adams would have to surrender the house to his political rival and former friend. The defeat was personal and painful, made more bitter by the fact that Adams would be the first president to lose re-election. In those final weeks in the president's house, walking through its cold, unfinished rooms, Adams must have reflected on the ironies of his situation. He had been the first to live in this symbol of American democracy, yet he would also be the first to demonstrate the peaceful transfer of power that was democracy's greatest achievement. Flames over the Capitol, the burning of the White House, 1814. On the evening of August 24, 1814, British Rear Admiral George Cockburn stood before the White House with a torch in his hand and vengeance in his heart. Behind him, battle-hardened soldiers of His Majesty's forces, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars who had defeated Napoleon's armies across Europe, prepared to commit an act that would become one of the most infamous moments in American history, the War of 1812, which Americans had started with such confidence, believing they could easily conquer British Canada while Britain was distracted fighting Napoleon, had turned into a disaster. Now British forces had marched virtually unopposed into Washington, D.C., and they were about to burn the most powerful symbol of American government, the President's house. The day had begun with chaos and panic in the capital city. For weeks, rumors had swirled that British forces were approaching, but the American government had been paralyzed by incompetence, political infighting, and a fatal underestimation of British resolve. President James Madison, a brilliant political theorist but an ineffective war leader, had finally been forced to confront reality when British ships appeared in Chesapeake Bay and troops began their march toward Washington. The president had ridden out to observe American defensive positions at Bladensburg, Maryland, just northeast of the capital, where a hastily assembled force of militia and regular troops prepared to stop the British advance. What happened at Bladensburg would go down in history as one of the most humiliating defeats American forces ever suffered. The Battle of Bladensburg lasted barely 2 hours before American forces broke and ran in what became known as the Bladensburg Races, with militia throwing down their weapons and fleeing in terror from the disciplined British assault. President Madison himself nearly fell into British hands, escaping only because his horse was fast and the British were more interested in reaching Washington than capturing a fleeing president. As news of the defeat reached the capital, panic erupted. Government officials scrambled to save important documents, with State Department clerks hastily packing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution into linen bags for evacuation. Citizens fled their homes, clogging the roads with wagons, carriages, and people on foot, all desperate to escape before the British arrived. At the White House, First Lady Dolly Madison demonstrated a courage and presence of mind that would make her an American legend. While her husband was fleeing from Bladensburg, Dolly received urgent messages telling her to abandon the president's house immediately. British forces were approaching, and there was no time to lose. But Dolly Madison refused to panic. She methodically supervised the removal of valuable items from the house, determined that the British would not capture symbols of American independence. Her most famous act that day was saving the full-length portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart, which hung in the dining room. When her servants struggled to remove the large, heavy frame from the wall, Dolly ordered them to break the frame and cut the canvas from it. The portrait was rolled up and spirited away just hours before British troops arrived. The British forces entered Washington in the late afternoon of August 24th, marching down streets lined with abandoned homes and shuttered businesses. The city that Americans had envisioned as a great capital was still more aspiration than reality 14 years after the government had moved there. The buildings were scattered across a wide area connected by poor roads, and much of the federal district remained forest and farmland. The British officers were actually surprised by how modest and incomplete the American capital appeared. They had expected something grander from a nation that had dared to challenge the British Empire. When British commanders reached the White House, they found it completely abandoned. The front door stood open, and inside, the scene was surreal. In the dining room, a table was set for 40 guests, with food laid out and wine poured as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-preparation for a dinner party. In reality, Dolly Madison had ordered dinner prepared for her husband and his officers, expecting them to return victorious from Bladensburg. Instead, British officers sat down at President Madison's table and ate the meal prepared for American victory, drinking presidential wine and mocking their absent hosts. Admiral Cockburn reportedly took souvenirs from the president's house, including one of Madison's hats and a cushion from Dolly's chair, which he crudely joked he would use to remember Mrs. Madison's seat. After their mocking feast, the British officers gave the order that transformed the evening from an embarrassing occupation into a national tragedy. Soldiers spread throughout the White House carrying torches, flammable materials, and orders to burn the building to the ground. This was not random destruction or the undisciplined looting that sometimes occurred when armies sacked cities. This was deliberate policy, ordered by British commanders as retaliation for American forces having burned government buildings in York, the capital of Upper Canada, the previous year. The British had come to Washington specifically to burn public buildings as a lesson to Americans about the consequences of starting wars they could not win. The soldiers worked methodically, piling furniture in the center of rooms and dousing it with gunpowder paste and oil to ensure the fires would burn hot enough to destroy the stone structure itself. Starting on the ground floor, they moved from room to room, igniting the prepared piles and watching as flames leaped up the silk curtains and licked at the ornate plasterwork on the ceilings. The East Room, which Abigail Adams had once used to dry laundry, became an inferno. The Oval Drawing Room, where presidents had received foreign diplomats, filled with choking smoke and searing heat. Within an hour, flames were shooting from every window of the White House, and the sandstone walls themselves began to crack and crumble from the intense heat. From miles away, Americans who had fled the Capitol could see the orange glow lighting up the night sky. President Madison, hiding in the Virginia countryside, received reports of the destruction with despair and fury. The White House, which had taken 8 years to build and had served as the residence of only 3 presidents, was being reduced to a burned-out shell in a single night. The symbolism was devastating. The British had reached the heart of American government and destroyed it with impunity, demonstrating that the United States could not even defend its own capital city. The fires burned through the night, and by morning the White House was a blackened ruin. The roof had collapsed, the interior was completely destroyed, and only the outer sandstone walls remained standing, their surface scorched black by the flames and stained by smoke. The British had also burned the Capitol building, the Treasury, and other government structures before withdrawing from Washington the next day, their mission of retaliation complete. A providential thunderstorm on August 25th helped extinguish the remaining fires and may have saved the damaged walls from complete collapse. But the destruction was total enough to make many question whether the capital would or should remain in Washington. Standing amid the ruins in the following days, surveying the destruction of the building that had symbolized American democracy, government officials faced a crucial decision. Some in Congress argued for abandoning Washington entirely and moving the capital to a safer, more established city like Philadelphia or New York. The destruction of the White House and Capitol seemed to prove that Washington, D.C. was indefensible and perhaps a mistake from the beginning. But others argued passionately that abandoning the capital would be surrendering to British intimidation, admitting that America lacked the will to rebuild what had been destroyed. The debate would rage for months while the blackened ruins of the White House stood as a stark reminder of American vulnerability and British power. Rising from the ashes, the rebirth of the White House 1815 to 1817. In the gray dawn following the British withdrawal from Washington in late August of 1814, architect James Hoban returned to the city he had helped build and walked slowly toward the ruins of the President's house. Hoban, now in his 50s, had designed and overseen the original construction of the building more than 20 years earlier, watching it rise from wilderness into an elegant symbol of American democracy. Now, as he approached the blackened shell that remained, his heart must have broken at the sight. The structure he had labored over for 8 years stood gutted and hollow, its windows empty black voids, its roof completely gone and its interior reduced to charred timber and collapsed plasterwork. Smoke damage stained the once pristine sandstone walls, and the acrid smell of burned wood and fabric still hung heavy in the air. Yet Hoban, ever the professional, began immediately to assess whether the building could be saved or whether it would need to be completely demolished and rebuilt. The question of what to do with the ruined President's house became intensely political in the months following the burning of Washington. The disaster had exposed not just the vulnerability of the capital city, but deeper questions about the very nature of the American experiment. Some members of Congress, particularly representatives from northern states, seized on the destruction as an opportunity to relocate the capital to Philadelphia, New York, or another established city. They argued that Washington, D.C. had always been a problematic choice, a swampy, unhealthy location chosen through political compromise rather than practical wisdom. The burning, they insisted, was proof that the federal city was indefensible and should be abandoned. Bills were introduced in Congress proposing the move, and for several months it appeared that Washington might indeed lose its status as the nation's capital. President James Madison, however, was adamant that the government would remain in Washington and that the public buildings would be rebuilt. For Madison, abandoning Washington would be a symbolic defeat as damaging as any military loss. It would signal to Britain and the world that America lacked the resources and determination to maintain its independence. Madison threw his political weight behind keeping the capital in Washington, and immediately authorized Hoban to begin assessing the damage and planning the reconstruction. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate represented more than practicality. It was a declaration that America would not be intimidated or deterred by destruction, that the young nation had the resilience to rise from literal ashes. James Hoban's detailed inspection of the ruined president's house brought both good and troubling news. The exterior sandstone walls, though severely damaged and discolored by fire and smoke, remained structurally sound. The intense heat had caused some stones to crack and crumble, particularly around the windows and doors where the flames had been most concentrated, but the walls could be repaired rather than replaced. This was crucial, as quarrying and transporting new sandstone would have added years to the reconstruction and multiplied the costs beyond what Congress might approve. However, the interior was a total loss. Every floor, wall, ceiling, and decorative element would need to be completely rebuilt. The roof structure had collapsed into the building, and clearing the debris alone would take months. Congress, despite ongoing debates about relocating the capital, appropriated funds for the reconstruction in early 1815. The amount was substantial but nowhere near adequate for the scope of work required. Hoban would need to rebuild not just what had been destroyed, but create a more refined and completed version of his original vision. The War of 1812 officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, and as peace returned, the rebuilding of the President's house took on symbolic importance as a sign of national renewal and confidence. Workers began clearing the ruins in the spring of 1815, carting away tons of charred debris and carefully salvaging anything that could be reused. The reconstruction presented Hoban with both challenges and opportunities. He retained the basic floor plan and exterior appearance of the original structure, but he refined and improved many details. The interior was reconstructed with better materials and more sophisticated craftsmanship than had been possible in the rushed original construction. Hoban also addressed practical problems that had plagued the building from the beginning, improving heating systems, ventilation, and the layout of service spaces. The work proceeded slowly, hampered by the same problems that had plagued the original construction: difficulty obtaining materials, shortages of skilled labor, and insufficient funding that required constant appeals to Congress for additional appropriations. As the reconstruction progressed through 1815 and 1816, a crucial decision was made about the exterior appearance of the building. The sandstone walls, though structurally sound, were badly stained and discolored by the fire. The once pale stone now bore ugly black and brown streaks where smoke had penetrated the porous surface. Some stones were cracked or crumbling and needed to be replaced or repaired. Hoban decided that the entire exterior should be painted with a thick coat of white lead paint, both to protect the damaged stone from weathering and to restore the building's dignified appearance. This was not the first time the exterior had been painted. A whitewash mixture had been applied to protect the stone even during the original construction, but the 1816 repainting was far more extensive and used a more durable paint mixture. The application of brilliant white paint to cover the fire damage had an unintended but lasting consequence. It reinforced and popularized the nickname White House for the President's House. The building had occasionally been called the White House even before 1814, as its pale sandstone and periodic whitewashing made it stand out dramatically against the surrounding landscape, but the name had not been official or universally used. After the reconstruction, however, when the building emerged gleaming white, the nickname became increasingly common in newspapers, letters, and popular conversation. The brilliant white paint made the building even more distinctive and memorable, a beacon visible from far across the Potomac. Though it would not become the official name until President Theodore Roosevelt designated it so in 1902, the name White House became firmly established in the public imagination during this period of Reconstruction. The rebuilding took far longer than initially expected, stretching through all of 1816 and into 1817. President Madison never returned to live in the reconstructed building. He and Dolly spent the remainder of his presidency living in temporary quarters, first in the Octagon House owned by Colonel John Taylor, and later in a rented house on Pennsylvania Avenue. Madison's successor, James Monroe, who took office in March 1817, was also forced to wait. The house was still not fully ready for occupancy, with painters, plasterers, and craftsmen working frantically to finish the interior rooms. Monroe, impatient and eager to establish himself in the proper presidential residence, pressured Hoban and the workers to complete at least a portion of the building so he could move in. Finally, in the fall of 1817, President Monroe moved into the rebuilt White House, even though significant portions of the interior remained unfinished. The building that Monroe occupied was both familiar and transformed. From the outside, it looked much as it had before the fire, but the brilliant white paint made it more striking than ever before. Inside, the rooms were more elegantly finished than they had been originally, with finer plasterwork, better proportions, and more sophisticated decoration. Yet the building was still incomplete, lacking furniture for many rooms, and would require additional work and appropriations for years to come. Monroe would spend much of his presidency gradually furnishing and completing the White House, often using his own money when Congress balked at appropriations. The reconstruction of the White House after the burning of 1814 represented more than the repair of a building. It was a declaration of American resilience, determination, and confidence in the future. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate the Capitol, to restore the president's house to an even finer condition than before, sent a powerful message that the United States would not be deterred by setbacks or intimidated by enemies. The gleaming white building that emerged from the ashes became an even more powerful symbol than the original had been, representing a nation that could endure destruction and emerge stronger. The House divided. Lincoln's White House during the Civil War 1861 to 1865. On the cold morning of March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol and took the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States, knowing that he was inheriting a nation already tearing itself apart. 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America, and more would soon follow. As Lincoln moved into the White House later that day, accompanied by his wife Mary and their 3 sons, he entered a building that would become far more than a residence over the next 4 tumultuous years. The White House would transform into a military headquarters, a communication center, a hospital, a fortress, and above all, the nerve center from which Lincoln would direct the most devastating war in American history. A conflict that would determine whether the nation would survive and whether millions of enslaved people would gain their freedom. The White House that Lincoln occupied in 1861 was vastly different from the elegant mansion presidents had enjoyed in peacetime. Within weeks of his inauguration, the building took on the atmosphere of a besieged fortress. Washington, D.C. itself was a southern city in culture and geography, surrounded by slave states, with Virginia just across the Potomac River. When Virginia seceded in April 1861, Confederate flags could be seen flying from buildings visible from the White House windows. The city filled with Union troops, transforming the Capitol into an armed camp. Soldiers camped on the White House grounds, their tents dotting the lawns and their campfires glowing at night. The East Room, which had hosted elegant receptions and balls, was temporarily converted into troop quarters, with soldiers sleeping on the polished floors where diplomats had once danced. Lincoln established his office in a small room on the second floor of the White House, now known as the Lincoln Bedroom, though it was never actually his bedroom. This modest chamber became perhaps the most important room in America during the Civil War. Here, Lincoln spent countless hours poring over military maps, reading telegrams from the battlefield, meeting with generals, cabinet members, and politicians, and agonizing over the decisions that would determine the fate of the nation. The walls were covered with maps showing troop positions, railroad lines, and the constantly shifting battle lines. Telegraph equipment was installed in the War Department building next door, and Lincoln made the short walk there multiple times daily, often late at night, to receive the latest news from the front and send orders to commanders in the field. The pressure on Lincoln was unimaginable. He was fighting a war against fellow Americans, many of whom had been friends and colleagues before secession. He was learning military strategy on the job, having no real military experience beyond a brief and undistinguished stint in the Black Hawk War decades earlier. He had to manage quarrelsome generals, navigate treacherous politics, hold together a fractious coalition, and make decisions that sent thousands of men to their deaths. The White House became a place of constant crisis, with messengers arriving at all hours bearing news of battles won and lost, military disasters, and political emergencies. Lincoln slept little, often wandering the halls of the White House late at night, the weight of the nation's suffering visible in his increasingly haggard face. The White House also became a place where ordinary citizens could access their president in ways unimaginable today. Lincoln maintained an open-door policy that would horrify modern security officials. Every morning, crowds of people would line up outside his office waiting for their chance to see the president. They came seeking jobs, military appointments, pardons for condemned soldiers, help with personal problems, or simply to shake the hand of the man leading the nation through its darkest hour. Lincoln called these exhausting sessions his public opinion baths, and though they drained his energy, he believed they kept him connected to the people he served. He would listen patiently to requests and stories, many of them heartbreaking tales of sons killed in battle or families torn apart by the war. Mary Lincoln struggled with her role as First Lady during these terrible years. She was a Southern woman whose own brothers fought for the Confederacy, making her suspect in the eyes of many Northerners who whispered that she was a Confederate spy. The death of their 11-year-old son Willie from typhoid fever in February 1862, probably caused by contaminated water in the White House itself, plunged both Lincolns into profound grief. Willie died in a bedroom on the second floor, and Mary never entered that room again during her remaining time in the White House. Lincoln, already burdened with the deaths of hundreds of thousands in the war, now carried personal grief that friends said nearly broke him. The White House, which should have been a home, became a place of mourning and sorrow. Yet the White House was also where some of the most momentous decisions in American history were made. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln drafted the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in his White House office, working in secrecy on a document that would transform the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a crusade to end slavery. He shared his draft with his cabinet in July, but Secretary of State William Seward convinced him to wait for a Union military victory before announcing it, lest it appear an act of desperation. After the Battle of Antietam in September 1860, to provide the needed victory, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, he signed the final Emancipation Proclamation in the White House, his hand trembling not from doubt but from fatigue after hours of shaking hands at the traditional New Year's reception. He steadied his hand before signing, saying he wanted no one to think he had hesitated. The White House during Lincoln's presidency became a meeting place for an extraordinary range of people. Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist and former slave, visited Lincoln in the White House on multiple occasions, a revolutionary act in a building that had been constructed partly by enslaved labor. Lincoln met with his generals in the White House, sometimes in heated arguments about military strategy. Ulysses S. Grant, the general who would finally win the war, conferred with Lincoln in the White House about the brutal campaigns of 1864 and 1865. Lincoln met with delegations of Native Americans, with European visitors, with freed slaves, and with political enemies whom he appointed to high positions because they were competent, famously saying he needed every tool in the toolbox. The physical White House suffered during the war years. The building was shabby and worn, its furnishings damaged by heavy use and neglect. The grounds were trampled by soldiers and marred by military fortifications. Security concerns meant that public receptions became less frequent and more heavily guarded, though Lincoln resisted suggestions that he completely isolate himself. After assassination threats became common, guards were finally posted at the White House, though Lincoln chafed at these restrictions and often evaded his protection to walk alone at night to the War Department or to visit wounded soldiers in nearby hospitals. As the war ground toward its bloody conclusion in early 1865, the White House reflected both the exhaustion and hope of the nation. Lincoln, re-elected in 1864 despite predictions he would lose, grew increasingly focused on the question of how to reunite the nation after the war ended. He spoke of binding up the nation's wounds and pursuing peace with malice toward none, with charity for all. In his White House office, he planned for reconstruction, for healing, for somehow bringing former enemies back together. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, effectively ending the war. Washington erupted in celebration, and crowds gathered at the White House, calling for Lincoln to speak. He appeared at a window and gave a brief, thoughtful address about Reconstruction, one that disappointed those hoping for triumphant rhetoric. Just 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln left the White House in the evening to attend a play at Ford's Theater. He would never return alive. When assassin John Wilkes Booth shot him that night, Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across from the theater, where he died the following morning. His body was brought back to the White House and laid in state in the East Room, the same room where his son Willie had been mourned 3 years earlier. A new name for a new century. Theodore Roosevelt and the White House 1901 to 1902. On September 14, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office as the 26th President of the United States in a private home in Buffalo, New York, under the most tragic of circumstances. President William McKinley had been shot by an anarchist 8 days earlier and had finally succumbed to his wounds. At 42 years old, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest person ever to assume the presidency, and he brought with him to Washington an energy, ambition, and reforming zeal that would transform not just the office, but the very building that housed it. Within a year of moving into the executive mansion, Roosevelt would make a decision that seems simple in retrospect, but was actually quite revolutionary. He would officially designate the president's residence as the White House, ending more than a century of confusion and inconsistency about what to call the most famous house in America. When the Roosevelt family moved into the executive mansion in the fall of 1901, they arrived like a force of nature. Theodore and his wife Edith had 6 children ranging from teenagers to toddlers, and the building had never seen anything quite like the organized chaos they brought with them. The younger Roosevelt children treated the White House like an enormous playground, roller skating through the East Room, sliding down banisters, walking on stilts through the halls, and keeping a menagerie of pets that included snakes, guinea pigs, a badger, a bear, and a pony that they once brought up in the elevator to visit a sick brother. The staid mansion that had hosted formal diplomatic receptions and solemn state occasions suddenly echoed with the laughter and shrieks of children, much to the consternation of the permanent staff who had served more sedate previous administrations. But Roosevelt's impact on the building went far beyond his boisterous family life. Almost immediately upon moving in, he recognized that the executive mansion had serious problems. The building that had seemed so grand in 1800 now seemed cramped and inadequate for the needs of a modern presidency. The United States had emerged from the Spanish-American War as a world power with overseas territories and global responsibilities. Yet the president's house was still essentially arranged as it had been a century earlier, with the president's family living on the same floor where official business was conducted. The second floor contained both the private family quarters and the executive offices, meaning that clerks, visitors, officials, and favor seekers tramped constantly through what should have been private family space. The Roosevelt children literally played in the same hallways where their father conducted the nation's business. Moreover, the building itself was in poor physical condition after a century of use modifications and neglect. The structure was unsound in places, with floors that sagged alarmingly and a roof that leaked. The plumbing was antiquated, the electrical system was dangerous, and the heating was inadequate. Various presidents had made piecemeal additions and changes over the decades, resulting in an architectural hodgepodge that lacked coherence or efficiency. The building that was supposed to represent American prestige to the world was actually rather shabby and embarrassing when compared to the palaces and government buildings of European capitals. Roosevelt, who had a keen sense of the presidency's symbolic importance, found this situation intolerable. Roosevelt convinced Congress to appropriate funds for a major renovation and expansion of the executive mansion, the most extensive work done on the building since its reconstruction after the War of 1812. He hired the distinguished architectural firm of McKim, Mead & White to undertake the project, giving them a mandate to preserve the historical character of the original structure while modernizing it and adding the office space that a 20th century presidency required. The architect's solution was elegant. They would restore the main house to its original residential purpose while constructing a new west wing that would house executive offices, removing the functional conflict that had plagued the building since its construction. The renovation began in June of 1902, and it was extraordinarily ambitious both in scope and timeline. Roosevelt insisted that the work be completed in time for the social season beginning in December, giving the architects and contractors only 6 months to accomplish what would normally take years. The Roosevelt family moved out temporarily while workers gutted and rebuilt much of the interior. The project removed Victorian-era additions and decorations that had accumulated over the decades, returning the staterooms to something closer to their original neoclassical design. The work strengthened the structure, modernized all the building systems, improved circulation and access, and most importantly, created the new West Wing to house the executive offices. It was during this renovation and reorganization that Roosevelt made his decision about the building's name. For more than a century, the building had been called by various names with no official designation. The formal name used in government documents was the Executive Mansion, a term that seemed stuffy and pretentious to many Americans. Informally, it had long been called the President's House or the Presidential Mansion. The nickname White House had been in popular use since at least the 1820s, becoming especially common after the building was repainted brilliant white following the fire of 1814. But this nickname had never been officially recognized or consistently used in government correspondence. Roosevelt understood the power of symbols and language. He recognized that Executive Mansion sounded monarchical and formal, out of step with American democratic values and the more accessible presidency he was trying to create. President's House was accurate but bland and uninspiring. White House, however, was simple, direct, memorable, and distinctly American. It was the name ordinary people already used, and it captured something essential about the building, its most distinctive physical characteristic, the brilliant white painted exterior that made it instantly recognizable. The name suggested openness and transparency, qualities Roosevelt wanted to associate with his presidency. It was also unique. No other nation's executive residence was called simply by its color, making the name distinctly American rather than an imitation of European titles like palace or castle. In October of 1902, Roosevelt made the decision official. He ordered that all Executive Mansion stationery be printed with the heading "The White House" rather than Executive Mansion. This seems like a small administrative detail, but it was actually quite significant. By changing the official letterhead, Roosevelt was exercising presidential authority to formally designate the building's name, establishing the White House as the proper and official title for the president's residence. The decision was announced without fanfare or lengthy explanation. Roosevelt simply began using the name consistently in all official correspondence, and the rest of the government followed suit. The timing of Roosevelt's decision was not coincidental. The renovation and expansion of the building provided a natural moment for rethinking and rebranding. As the building was being physically transformed for the 20th century, Roosevelt was also transforming its identity and image. The completion of the renovated White House in December 1902 was unveiled with great public interest. Newspapers marveled at the improved building, the elegant restoration of the staterooms, and the practical efficiency of the new West Wing. The building emerged from the renovation looking much as it does today in its basic layout and appearance, and it now had an official name that matched its popular reputation. Roosevelt's decision to officially name the building the White House reflected his broader approach to the presidency. He believed in making government more accessible and understandable to ordinary Americans, in using clear and direct language rather than bureaucratic formality, and in creating symbols that represented American democracy's unique character. By embracing the popular nickname and making it official, he was in a sense democratizing the presidency, acknowledging that the people's name for the building should be its official name. The decision also reflected Roosevelt's understanding of modern media and public relations. The White House was simply a better brand, more memorable and marketable than the formal alternatives. The Hidden Crisis, Gutting and Rebuilding the White House, 1948 to 1952. On a quiet afternoon in February 1948, President Harry S. Truman was sitting in his second-floor study in the White House when he felt the floor beneath him tremble and sway. It was not an earthquake. It was something far more alarming. The floor of the White House itself was moving, groaning under the weight of the building above it. Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri who had never sought the presidency, but had been thrust into it upon Franklin Roosevelt's death in 1945, now faced a crisis that had nothing to do with the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, or the Berlin Airlift. The White House, the most famous residence in America, the symbol of executive power that had stood for nearly 150 years, was literally falling apart, and engineers would soon determine that the building was in such dangerous structural condition that it could collapse at any moment, potentially killing everyone inside. The problem had been developing for decades, perhaps even since the building's original construction. But successive presidents and administrations had ignored the warning signs or applied only superficial fixes to what was actually a catastrophic structural failure. The White House had been built in stages over many years, with the original construction in the 1790s, the reconstruction after the fire of 1814, and numerous additions, modifications, and renovations over the subsequent century and a half. Each generation of builders had made changes without fully understanding or respecting the original structure, cutting through load-bearing walls, adding heavy materials to floors and ceilings that were never designed to support such weight, and fundamentally compromising the building's integrity. The addition of modern amenities like central heating, plumbing, electricity, and air conditioning had required cutting through structural elements and adding equipment that put stress on the aging framework. By the time Truman occupied the White House, the building had hosted 29 presidents and had survived the War of 1812, the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and countless political crises, but had never received the comprehensive structural evaluation and renovation it desperately needed. The warning signs had been there for years. Previous presidents and staff had complained about sagging floors, cracking plaster, and mysterious creaking sounds, but these had been dismissed as the normal settling of an old building. During the Coolidge administration in the 1920s, Engineers had warned that the roof structure was unsound and needed replacing, leading to the addition of a new third floor and roof, but even that major project had not addressed the deeper structural problems in the building's core. When engineers finally conducted a thorough investigation of the White House's structure in 1948, what they discovered was horrifying. The building was essentially a disaster waiting to happen. The wooden beams and joists that supported the floors were rotted, cracked, and in some cases completely separated from the walls they were supposed to support. The floors were held up in places by nothing more than the plaster ceilings of the rooms below them, and those ceilings were themselves in danger of collapse. The historic exterior walls, the sandstone structure that had survived the fire of 1814, were bulging outward because the interior structure was no longer properly supporting them. The building was quite literally pulling itself apart, and engineers warned that a fire, a crowd of people gathered for a reception, or even just the accumulated stress of daily use could trigger a catastrophic collapse. The engineers presented Truman with essentially three options. They could attempt to shore up the existing structure with steel reinforcements and hope it would hold. They could tear down the entire building and construct a completely new White House. Or they could preserve the historic exterior walls while completely gutting and rebuilding the interior with modern materials and engineering. Truman, a man who loved American history and understood the symbolic importance of the White House, rejected the idea of demolition entirely. He would not be the president who destroyed the house where Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation and where generations of American leaders had lived. Instead, he chose the most ambitious and expensive option, a complete interior reconstruction that would preserve the historic shell while essentially building a new house inside it. The project that began in December 1948 was extraordinary in its scope and unprecedented in the history of presidential residences. The Truman family moved out of the White House and took up residence across the street in Blair House, which would be their home for nearly 4 years. Then workers began the painstaking process of dismantling the interior of the White House, piece by piece, room by room. Everything that could be saved was carefully removed, cataloged, and stored: mantels, moldings, chandeliers, door frames, paneling, and historic architectural elements. The workers removed layers of history, finding underneath the elegant staterooms the remains of earlier iterations of the White House. Evidence of the 1814 fire, modifications made by various presidents, and even artifacts from the original 1790s construction. Once the interior had been stripped, the real work began. Workers excavated beneath the White House, digging down to create a proper foundation and basement that the building had never really had. They constructed a steel frame inside the historic exterior walls, essentially building a modern building within the shell of the old one. This steel skeleton would support all the floors, the roof, and the interior walls, taking the structural load off the historic exterior walls for the first time in the building's history. It was engineering on a massive scale, requiring hundreds of workers and presenting constant challenges. The work had to be done carefully to avoid damaging or destabilizing the historic exterior walls, which were preserved and restored with meticulous attention to detail. During the 4 years of reconstruction, the gutted White House became a construction site that looked like something from a war zone. Photographs from the period show the exterior walls standing hollow and empty, with massive steel beams visible through the windows and construction equipment filling what had been elegant rooms. The public was fascinated and horrified by images showing the president's house reduced to an empty shell. Many Americans had no idea that the White House had been in such dangerous condition, and the revelation sparked debates about government maintenance, historic preservation, and whether the building should have been replaced entirely with something modern rather than rebuilt to look like the old structure. Truman took a personal interest in every detail of the reconstruction. He visited the construction site regularly, examining the work and making decisions about how rooms should be configured and decorated. He was determined that the rebuilt White House would not just be safe and modern, but would also respect and preserve the historical character of the building. The architects and engineers working on the project had to balance multiple competing demands: structural safety, modern functionality, historical authenticity, and the practical needs of a 20th century presidency. The result was a building that looked much like the old White House from the outside and in its main staterooms, but which was actually completely new underneath, with modern plumbing, electrical systems, heating and air conditioning, and most importantly, a steel structure that would support the building safely for generations to come. The reconstruction cost nearly $6 million, an enormous sum in the late 1940s, and took far longer than initially estimated. The project was criticized in Congress and in the press as extravagant and unnecessary, with some arguing that the money could have been better spent on schools, hospitals, or other public needs. Truman defended the project vigorously, arguing that the White House belonged to all Americans and that preserving this symbol of the presidency and the nation's history was worth the cost. He framed it as an investment in American heritage and a necessary modernization of a building that had to serve as both a home and a working office for the leader of the free world. Finally, in March 1952, the Truman family moved back into the rebuilt White House. From the outside, the building looked much as it had before, its white-painted exterior walls standing proudly as they had for a century and a half, but inside everything was new. The rooms had been reconstructed using the saved historical elements wherever possible, so the staterooms looked appropriately historic, but they now had modern infrastructure hidden behind the walls. The building that had been on the verge of collapse was now structurally sound and equipped for modern presidential needs. The living monument, the White House in modern memory, 1952 present. When visitors stand on Pennsylvania Avenue today gazing through the iron fence at the White House gleaming white against the Washington sky, they are looking at a building that embodies more than 2 centuries of American history, dreams, triumphs, and tragedies. The elegant neoclassical facade they see appears timeless and unchanging, suggesting stability and continuity in a rapidly changing world. Yet this appearance of permanence is itself an illusion, carefully maintained through constant work and periodic transformation. The White House that stands today is simultaneously very old and remarkably new, a palimpsest of history where each generation has left its mark while claiming to preserve what came before. It is a building that has burned and been rebuilt, that has been gutted to its exterior walls and reconstructed from within, that has witnessed unimaginable joy and profound sorrow, and that continues to accumulate new layers of meaning with each passing year. The modern White House, the building that emerged from the Truman Reconstruction in 1952, has witnessed some of the most dramatic moments in recent American history within its walls. It was in the White House that John F. Kennedy confronted the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, spending 13 days in meetings with advisors, agonizing over decisions that could have triggered nuclear war and ended human civilization. The Oval Office, the president's formal workspace created during the Taft administration and relocated during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, has been the setting for momentous announcements that shaped the world. Declarations of war, peace treaties, civil rights legislation, and addresses to the nation during times of crisis. It was from the White House that Lyndon Johnson directed the escalation of the Vietnam War, while simultaneously pushing through the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, a tragic contradiction that would ultimately destroy his presidency. The White House has also been a stage for scandal and disgrace, moments when the building's symbolic power was tarnished by the actions of those who occupied it. The Watergate scandal that consumed Richard Nixon's presidency in the early 1970s transformed the White House into a symbol of corruption and abuse of power. The revelation that Nixon had installed a secret recording system throughout the building, capturing thousands of hours of conversations that would ultimately prove his involvement in criminal activity, shocked Americans who wanted to believe in the sanctity of the office. Nixon's resignation in August 1974, announced from the Oval Office, was the first and only presidential resignation in American history, a moment when the White House witnessed the consequences of unchecked executive power and the ultimate vindication of the rule of law. Yet the building has also been a place of healing and reconciliation. When Gerald Ford took the oath of office following Nixon's resignation, he famously declared that our long national nightmare is over, attempting to restore dignity and trust to a White House that had been sullied by scandal. The White House has hosted historic moments of diplomatic breakthrough, including the Camp David Accords signed on the White House lawn in 1978, bringing peace between Egypt and Israel. It was in the White House that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev developed the personal relationship that helped end the Cold War, proving that the building could be a place where enemies became partners and where the course of history could be peacefully redirected. The hidden stories of the White House are perhaps even more fascinating than the well-known historical moments. The building has a vast underground complex that most visitors never see, including bunkers, tunnels, and secure facilities that were constructed during World War II and the Cold War. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, a fortified bunker beneath the East Wing, became briefly famous when Vice President Dick Cheney was taken there during the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. The White House has miles of corridors, hundreds of rooms, and countless spaces that serve purely functional purposes. Kitchens that can prepare dinner for hundreds of guests, maintenance shops, security operations centers, and the offices of the dozens of staff members who keep the building and the presidency running smoothly. The permanent staff of the White House, many of whom served through multiple administrations regardless of party, are the keepers of the building's institutional memory and hidden stories. The ushers, butlers, chefs, groundskeepers, and maintenance workers who work in the White House often spend decades there, witnessing history up close while remaining largely invisible to the public. They have seen presidents in their most private moments, witnessed the human reality behind the public image, and accumulated stories that rarely get told. Some have written memoirs that offer fascinating glimpses into life in the White House, revealing the building as a workplace, a home, and a peculiar kind of fishbowl where power and domesticity uneasily coexist. The White House grounds, which now encompass 18 acres in the heart of Washington, D.C., have their own remarkable history. The land has been transformed from the muddy hillside that George Washington surveyed to an elaborately landscaped estate that includes the famous Rose Garden, the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden, the South Lawn where Marine One lands, and even a putting green swimming pool, and bowling alley added by various presidents to suit their recreational preferences. The gardens have been the setting for state dinners on warm evenings, Easter egg rolls that have become beloved traditions, and peaceful moments of respite for presidents seeking escape from the pressures of office. Thomas Jefferson kept grizzly bears on the lawn, a gift from explorers Lewis and Clark. Various presidents have kept horses, sheep, cows, and even an alligator on the grounds over the years. Security around the White House has evolved dramatically, particularly after 9/11-2001, transforming the relationship between the building and the city around it. Pennsylvania Avenue, once a busy thoroughfare where traffic passed directly in front of the White House, was closed to vehicles in 1995, after the Oklahoma City bombing raised concerns about truck bombs. The security perimeter has expanded repeatedly with barriers, checkpoints, and surveillance systems that create a secure zone around the building. This increased security is necessary in an age of terrorism and threats against the president, but it has also created distance between the White House and the American people it serves, making the building feel less accessible and more fortress-like than the founders might have intended. The White House has become one of the most photographed buildings in the world, its image instantly recognizable across the globe as a symbol of American power and democracy. Yet photographs capture only the building's exterior perfection, the carefully maintained facade that presents an image of stability and authority. They cannot capture the weight of history that permeates every room, the accumulated emotion of 2 centuries of human drama, the whispered conversations in corridors where momentous decisions were made, or the lonely burden that every president has felt walking those halls at night. The building is haunted not by literal ghosts, despite numerous reports of paranormal experiences over the years, but by the ghosts of history, by the presence of all who have lived and worked there, by the decisions made and the consequences that flowed from them. Today, the White House continues to evolve, adapting to the needs of 21st century leadership while preserving its historical character. Modern presidents have added solar panels to the roof, upgraded communications and security systems, and made countless small changes to accommodate evolving technology and security requirements. Yet the fundamental structure remains recognizable, a testament to the vision of James Hoban, the determination of George Washington, and the resilience of a building that has survived fire, war, neglect, and the passage of time. The White House stands as a powerful reminder that democracy itself requires constant maintenance, that institutions must be preserved and protected, and that symbols matter in holding a nation together. It remains, above all, a house with stories still being written, a place where history is made every day, and a building that will continue to witness and shape American history for generations to come.